This is Hoplology with Immersion Talks again today. Today we have a really special presentation by Michael Belzer Sensei, a longtime student of Donn Draeger, and somebody who accompanied him on expeditions and quite a few private trainings. In addition to that, he was also entrusted with the unpublished works of Draeger and Hayes, aptly titled Theoretics of Hoplology. Now, to date, Sensei Belzer has worked on this book paragraph by paragraph with three people, Chip Hunter and David Hall, back in the early 80s, and post that throughout 21 and 22, Sensei and I have met almost on a weekly basis, where we've gone through all the works and its impact on Hoplology per se. Now, this presentation is a really good overview on understanding and getting a feel for the man himself, Donn Draeger. So what many don't know is he was the first Westerner ever to allowed into a Koryu, and his life is amazing. Now, without further ado, we just have this complete formal presentation by Belzer Sensei, and he's been so kind to give it over and hand it to us here at the Immersion Foundation so that we can bring it out to you as a podcast and share this. If you don't know this man and his work, you got to, and I would highly encourage you to watch the entire presentation, which has been done exquisitely well and with great love, and also share it with the people that may be interested in any kind of martial arts history, and Asian arts in general. So without further ado, Belzer Sensei bringing Donn Draeger to life.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining me. More about the life of Donn Draeger and his impact on the martial arts. What we're going to do is look at some images of Donn Draeger so you can see what he looked like over the years, and I'll also be able to give you some background information. Donn Draeger was a private man. He didn't share much about his personal life, but what we're going to use is the audio tapes, the excerpts, to cover 6 aspects of his life. Growing up, learning jiu-jitsu and judo, becoming a Marine, relocating to Japan to practice judo at the Kodokan, becoming a pioneer in the classical martial arts of Japan, the Koryu, becoming the author that we all know about, and then becoming the founder of modern Hoplology. This is the flyer that was produced for Camp Bushido back in 1970 that my dad brought home. Off to the left, you'll see Donn Draeger, Shimizu Sensei, his teacher, is in the middle, and Kaminota Tsunemori is on the far right. He was a senior instructor. That's a copy of the first letter that Donn Draeger wrote to me, and you heard what it had to say, so I don't have to go over that again for you. But the second letter shows the aerogram. How many people remember aerograms? The aerograms actually fold up and they mail like a postcard with the postage embossed on the corner. So he always had aerograms with him so that he could either type his responses or handwrite, even if he was out in the field. This is a picture of the entrance of the Rembukan dojo. This is the dojo of Donn Draeger and Shimizu Sensei, and the headquarters for Shindo Musoryu. This is the kind of scene that I saw when I was at the Rembukan the first time Draeger showed up. From across the floor, I saw Draeger talking to Shimizu Sensei, and I realized, that's the old man that was demonstrating with him. Let's listen to Donn Draeger talk about growing up.
Donn Draeger speaking from Narita, Japan.
A bit of my childhood background, which may at first not seem to tie in what I have to say, but I think it's necessary. I was quite which would probably be called a weird kid, as far as my parents were concerned, when I was quite young. From the age of 5, and annually during summer, I had good acquaintanceship with Chippewa Indians. We had a shack up in the northern part of Wisconsin, and I used to spend a hell of a lot, most of my summers there. As I got older, from about the age of 7, I actually stayed with the Indians in their villages. I canoed with them, I fished with them, I hunted with them, and so on. and played the games. And by the time I was 9 or 10, I could handle most of the teenage, semi-mature adults. I can remember tossing a few of the 14, 15, 16-year-olds very easily, because by that time I was already Nikki, Ikki, and Judo. I could never figure out my feet, the speed of the feet. And grappling on the ground, you may or may not know, Indians are terrible on the ground. If you get on their feet, they're elusive, and they can run like hell and so on. But get them on the ground, it's like a dog. It's helpless. You know what to do with it. So I gained a lot of respect, not only with my own age group, but with some of the elders of the villages. I was always welcome in summer. And I did a lot of, as I said, hunting with them. About the same time, but not the same time of the year, I had been printing away in my cousin's basement rifle range. He used a 22, an old Remington beat-up job. I can't even remember exactly what it was. I was only about 7 or 8, actually. And until my father found out about this, I was learning from my cousin how to shoot a 22 rifle. Well, to make a long story short, my father in particular was horrified at some of my activities. I had a deathly fear of weapons, particularly shooting weapons. And in the instance that I was given a hunting knife at one of my uncles, and I was cutting with it on one of the trees on my front lawn, the thing I shouldn't have done, but I didn't understand at that age. My father took the knife away from me. So whenever I went out somewhere, camping or something, I had a bootleg one from somebody else. As I recall, I didn't get any allowance, but through peddling papers and chewing gum and things from house to house, selling things, I was able to get enough money together to buy my first 22. I still have it. It's a Mossberg. It's one of the best rifles. They don't even beat them today. It had a micrometer rear sight and an adjustable ramp front sight. Stocked with a manly pistol grip. Full 4-stock. It's a beautiful rifle, really it is. They don't make them like this anymore. It's a bolt-action single shot. Shorts, longs, super longs, anything they wanted. I bought this for $6.95. I'll never forget the day. I was so proud, my first rifle. Of course, I couldn't let it be known that I owned it. So it was a breakdown model, and I wrapped it in newspaper, threw it in my coaster casually, and brought it home. In order that it would not become discovered, I stashed it high in the rafters of a garage where nobody ever went, maybe just the rats. So it stayed up there until I was about 13 or 14 and was able to explain where I got the money, and of an age old enough to still not be accepted, but a little bit harder to tell me not to have this weapon. Meanwhile, I had done a lot of plinking with it, Saturday afternoons, out along the interurban tracks, crows, woodchucks, occasional rabbit, things like that. So this is my early beginning, and I think it bears very much on the fact that I've always been attracted to weapons and have had a fair amount of experience, which I'm going to now relate.
Draeger's father was a salesman for Harley-Davidson motorcycles, and he would have visitors from Japan, from the Japanese motorcycle companies. And one of his regular visitors happened to know jiu-jitsu and started to teach young Donn down in the basement. We don't know the style, possibly Yoshin Ryu. After a while, Donn enrolled in a judo program and eventually made the transfer to Kodokan Judo and stayed with that throughout his lifetime. He joined the Marine Corps at the young age of 15. He received permission from his parents and went through the enlisted ranks. He became an officer. He saw service in World War II in Manchuria and Korea. The next excerpt we're going to listen to talks about an encounter he had while he was in the Marine Corps.
Tonight, it's cold enough to frost up my windows and stop the tap water in my kitchen sink from running. Aside from that, the weather is quite good. Bear in mind, I live in a house that has no heat, save that which comes from boiling water for tea, making a few simple meals, and my 200-watt bulb here over my desk. All year round, I follow the weather, the seasons, live a natural life, and no type of heating or air conditioning during the hot stages. I don't usually tell the next anecdote. I've said it only a few times to very select people. And I think I'll have to give you some idea that so that maybe what I'm saying about this arousal business drives a wedge a little bit deeper into what you are now thinking. I was in China, North China, 1945 and 46, before the communist takeover. As a Marine officer, we had plenty of spare time in the evenings. I used to pal around with Pat Boyle, former All-American Guard, University of Wisconsin, Big Ten heavyweight boxing champion. Pat and I were good buddies. We're about the same size. I'm a little taller. He was a bit heavier. But we had same kind of athletic and combative background. One evening, quite late, we got out of this Russian cafe where we normally had our evening meal. By the way, a huge steak, more than you could eat, smothered with fried potatoes and eggs and all the Russian delicacies, shashlik, borscht, and so on. 80 cents. Anyway, that's an aside. Anyway, Pat and I were heading back to the barracks. It's quite a long ways from this place called Runo's, by the way, in Tinsin. And the shortcut was down the infamous so-called Taku Road. Taku Road was placed off limits by the military, not only because it was full of, shall we say, places unbefitting an officer and a gentleman, but the very fact that it was roamed by street gangs who had an eye out for the rich Americano. Pat and I decided to risk it, and we took off down Taku Road, moving along at a pretty good fast walk. We heard, very suddenly, the pounding of feet behind us, padded kind of pound. They wore these padded shoes, and a quick look over the shoulder told us that at least 5 guys were on our tail. Okay, pulse quickened, not because of the effort of walking, because we didn't change that, but emotional arousal set in. Heartbeat pounded a little bit. The neck veins came up. So cool and calm on the outside, nobody would have noticed it. We whispered to each other, we're going to make a to the rear march and split these guys. Pat taking them to the right, me taking to the left. Whatever. He gets 2, I get 3, or whatever happened. Let it happen. So as they came up behind us, we did it to the rear. Pat split off 2 guys to his right, which was up against a wall for me, and I split 3 guys off next to the curb alongside the road. I can't remember everything, except that the first guy I got with an Osotogari, no hands to guide him. He landed on his head, bounced a little bit, and his leg fumbled. The other guy came up behind me, hugged me, that is, bear hugged me, and I put him over with a nice serenade, dropping on his face with my knee. I got up to face the third one, and he was heading for tall cotton. I whipped around. I saw Pat. One guy was already on the deck. I had no idea how he got there, except knowing Pat's skill with the fists. I could well imagine. The other fellow Pat had by the scruff of the jacket and was beating his head up against the brick wall repeatedly. And we let him go, slumped to the pavement. We moved out real quick. 4 bodies. There's no place to be found by a shore patrol or the friendly natives. I mention this because the It's still very vivid in my mind. Either Pat and I went into AR, very calm, very methodical. I don't think that the average visitor would have seen any difference on her face just an instant before we made the contact. But inside, I can speak for Pat, we were boiling. This is the emotional arousal that is healthy to the commitment that we had to face. To go into that thing calm and lackadaisical, which would fit calmness very nicely, relaxed. Well, I think we'd have been planted in Chinese soil, and this tape would never have been possible.
When I was 23, I was also looking for direction in my life, and my uncle was a colonel in World War II. My dad was enlisted Marines. My brother was a pilot in the Marine Corps, and so I was considering joining the Marine Corps. And I wrote to Donn about this, and here's what he had to say. You mentioned Marine OCS. Now that's something on which I'm an expert, being a professional Marine since age 15. It's a life, Mike, but unless you're pro all the way and drop all else but the core, it goes not too far. You, like me, could never go all the way to the top. The boys from Canoe College, Annapolis, and The Point were private military schools, VMI, Citadel, etc. Get the nod and officer promotions every time. One reason I got out is that I realized I could not go all the way. And if not able to go all the way, why hang around? I joined as an enlisted man during a time of crisis and made my way upward to officer status. But because I was not favored by the schooling above, I would always be held to max of brigadier general. Today, in peacetime, you'd be lucky to see full colonel rank after 30 years. Think it over. If that's what you want, are satisfied, go. You'd make a good Marine. Along with the demands of being a Marine, Draeger also maintained a very stringent course of weight training. And he eventually developed what has been known as the Draeger body. After the Marine Corps, he relocated to Japan. He lived in Tokyo and got himself established doing judo at the Kodokan. Let's listen to a clip of him talk about an encounter that happened while he was in Tokyo.
By way of comment on your big guy, small guy experience, I can appreciate what you're saying, but even at my relatively large size, I at times am also the small guy. I have had uncountable hundreds of experiences being the target of some big guy or even some little guy. In fact, the little guy usually attacks the big guy, like the dog nipping and yapping and barking, knowing that the big guy shouldn't ethically do anything about it. It reminds me of my friend Maurice Gruel of France, 250 pounds, 5th dan judo black belt. Maurice and I, many times in younger days, back in Tokyo, old Tokyo, we used to be walking along and some little Japanese with the whole width of the sidewalk to himself would insist on bumping into Maurice, some little 97-pounder into 250 pounds. So Maurice would very calmly grab him by the stacking swivel, literally lift him off his feet and say, "Ah, my friend, you are too little to hit, but I hit you anyway." Ah! And the guy would fly at him and kick up in the corner. So this idea of big and small, there's a lot of truth there, but sand gets kicked in the big guy's face lots of times. My second day in Tokyo, after returning from Southeast Asia, I had to go to immigration. On my way back, on one of the train platforms, I'm walking down the platform to get to the far end. There's a big Hulk, looked like a young sumo man, not particularly well structured, but huge, towered over me. Looked a little bit strange in the face, I would imagine mentally retarded. I was walking with the extreme edge of the platform on my left, and he stood coming on the same line I advanced. We were heading for a collision. He kind of leered and stood, and in other words, I'm going to have to move around me, sonny boy. He made some uncomplimentary remarks, and with kudo-like quality, if I do say so myself, I said to him in very articulate Japanese, "You're big, but you're just set up right for my soto so." That's a sumo term. So while his brain was clicking into gear, there's a round eye, talking Japanese, let alone trying to took it off dots. Secondly, here's this round eye, non-Japanese type, using a technical term which he couldn't possibly know. How could he know that? All of this is going through his mind. Then looking at the edge of the platform and the track 3 or 4 feet below, at his right, he probably said to himself, my God, I am set up for soaking the soul to that side. While this is all going on, I sidestepped, walked around him, and continued my journey down to the far end of the track. He did nothing, he didn't follow me. There was hostility in his action, and I used that type of approach or strategy to offset it. People on the platform around me were chuckling, and some of them were standing by in horror to see if there'd be any clash between us. So I too have the sand kicked in my face. I've had it hundreds of times, uncountable hundreds of times. You're not alone.
Draeger learned Japanese and became known not only to, of course, the Kodokan, but most of the dojo in the area and the teachers. He also lived in an area called Ichigaya of Tokyo and rented a large house and was able to rent out some of the spare rooms to other foreigners that were coming to Japan to learn about the martial arts. And because of Draeger's ability to speak Japanese and the fact that he knew as many of the teachers that he did in Tokyo, he was able to provide introductions and entrees for people that were looking for various arts. Let me read just an excerpt of one gentleman, Mr. Hargrove. After Draeger died, he wrote this, and it was printed in Black Belt magazine. He says, "Meeting Donn Draeger was like no other experience I had in Japan. Draeger was the perfect martial artist. At the time I met him, he was around 6 feet tall, 200 pounds of raw muscle. He was also very much at peace with himself. He seemed like a house cat that looked like a mountain lion. Draeger was well thought of by the Japanese because he did everything well. His Japanese was impeccable, no flaws or lack of confidence. He spoke Japanese like he was Japanese. Not only could he perform all of the arts well, but he stayed in top shape. When I was there, he must have been about 50. What most people don't know about Draeger is he didn't just learn martial arts in the service. He'd been out about 20 years. Most of the instructors in Japan were just teachers. He was a doer. He could go down to the Kodokan at 50 and just bust butts. The thing I admired most, however, was that he was a kind fellow. I remember my last days in Japan, before I boarded the plane for home. I was afraid I wouldn't see him before I left. I was in the coffee shop and he came in to say goodbye. As we were talking about old times, he mentioned I wasn't wearing my lapel pin. The pin was a symbol of togetherness. Most of the guys that had been together were wearing them. I had gotten my certificate, but I hadn't had a chance to get the pin. Draeger reached down to his lapel, took off his own pin, and pinned it on me. This man had always been helpful. He encouraged me to study, instructed me in Japanese etiquette, and told me to teach martial arts as a profession when I went home. This is a picture of Draeger in his judo gi. To his left is Isao Inokuma. The caption is talking about going to the Philippines, Borneo, the Celebes, and Sumatra for research. This is back in 1966. Isao Inokuma credits Donn Draeger with his win in the 1963 All Japan Judo Championships due to the weight training program that Draeger created for him. Draeger instituted systematic weight training to the Kodokan, and all the judo champions started to use weight training. Before, they kind of thought weights were bad. Draeger said it's the proper use of strength that's important. He had many firsts while he was there. He was the first foreigner to become a judo instructor at the Kodokan. In 1961, at the All Japan Judo Tournament, he was given the honor to be the Tori to demonstrate the Nage no Kata throwing forms. He also was the first foreigner to be allowed to study Jukendo. And Jukendo is a mock bayonet competition where they use kendo gear. While he was there, he met Shimizu Sensei. Shimizu Sensei was the headmaster of Shindo Musoryu Jojutsu. He liked what he saw. He was invited to come to the Rembukan and was the first foreigner allowed to join the Koryu of Shindo Musoryu. This clip shows Draeger practicing with the Jo, with Shimizu watching in the background against Kaminoda Sensei. The old style is taught as an apprenticeship. It's not a group style. You don't have one teacher with a big mat full of students. It's a very much one-on-one type of training. The Jo is always fighting the sword. It's never Jo against Jo. This particular kata is a long kata called ranai. It means to bring order out of confusion. Even though it's an old grainy film and a video at that, you can still catch the movement and some of the energy, which I think is really interesting. I had mentioned Jukendo. This is what Jukendo looks like. You've got the kendo gear and then the wooden bayonet with the mock, or the wooden rifle with the mock bayonet at the end. He was so successful. He was the first foreigner, as I mentioned, to be allowed to practice Jukendo and compete. He was so successful, they banned him from competition eventually. And what's interesting is that he credits his experience in Shindo Musoryu Jojutsu with his ability to win consistently in Jukendo. No one knows all of the ranks that he was awarded. This is just a partial list. A student of his heard him talk about this one day, and what he overheard is that if someone added them all up, it would probably be equivalent to 44th Dan. So that's kind of amazing. Of course, he was ranked in Judo, Kendo, Iaido, Modern Jodo, the old classical styles of Shindo Musoryu Jojutsu and Katori Shindoryu Kenjutsu, instructor licenses in both of those, and was also awarded Budo Kyoshi, full professor of the classical martial arts of Japan. While Draeger was studying Shindo Musoryu, I mean, one of the issues with that is that the Jo always beats the sword. That's just how all the kata are set up. He was very interested in the sword, wanted to learn more, and asked Shimizu Sensei, how would he do that? Who would he talk to? And Shimizu took him to meet Otake Sensei of the Katori Shintoryu. Katori Shintoryu is a sogo bujutsu, a composite bujutsu that has many weapons that was actually used in the battlefield. And it's still practiced today. It's over 500 years old. And let's watch Draeger now demonstrate a kata with one of Otake's sons. Draeger's on the one long sword versus Otake, a long and a short sword. most of us got to know the name Donn Draeger from all the books that he wrote. And the next clip is going to give Donn Draeger a chance to talk about creating his own publishing house. This would be for the Hoplology Center that he was envisioning for the big island of Hawaii.
One important section of the center will be devoted to our own publishing house. Many advantages, one of which being the ability to avoid the middleman and pay the extra fare when it comes to publication, printing, and so on of written material. We'll have our own printing shop. We plan to publish our own books, and initially, of course, the newsletter, MAI in a revived form, and eventually a scholarly journal on Hoplology will be our three projects. From time to time, as our committee work finalizes and comes to a conclusion, we will publish supplementary brochures or pamphlets on terminology common to systems and or weapons throughout the world. We already have some roughs on these latter things, and it's just a matter now of having the facility to do it. We could farm it out professionally, but we'd like to make the plunge with our own imprint on the particular publication. So we're holding back a bit. It'll be at least a year and a half before we can even begin to do that sort of thing.
Most of us got to know Donn Draeger by his books. I think Asian Fighting Arts might have been one of the first. That was the first for me, and Asian Fighting Arts was eventually reprinted to become Comprehensive Asian Fighting Arts. He followed that by his trilogy, Classical Bujutsu, Budo, and Modern Budo and Bujutsu. And this is where he really brought out the distinction between the fighting arts of the Jitsu forms and the personal development arts of the Do forms. While he was on his weapon safaris, many of his trips were in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and he encountered a fascinating variety of weapons and fighting systems, many of them Pencak Silat. This book was produced back in the 70s and became very popular back then because it was so interesting. Nobody had seen this stuff before. Now, through the efforts of Dan and Nasanto and others, Pencak Silat is out in the open, and this book is very much in demand. He wrote many books, over 30 books, publications, magazine articles. He actually published Martial Arts International, which was a magazine. Technical journals or technical books on techniques, history, tradition, specialty books like the ninja books. And you really couldn't tell from reading these books that he had a sense of humor, but he really did. If you hung out with him at all or did any training with him, he was pretty quick with a joke. As a matter of fact, he wrote a book called The Jokes on Judo, and it was a cartoon book. Now, how many people remember this book, Secret Fighting Arts of the World? It's not a joke, but we'll have to call it a spoof. It turns out that three guys were together one night and discussing all the different experiences they have had in the fighting arts and traveling around the world and the different instructors. Here's some of the table of contents. The delayed death touch, Ganges groin gouge, Parisian halitotic attack, the Macedonian buttock, the Patagonian purr cake. Well, turns out that John F. Gilby was a composite character, and it was, remember that guy that you saw the picture of, John Blooming? Well, this is that guy, John Blooming, with glasses written onto his face. That's where the first name John came from, John Blooming. F came from Donn F. Frederick Draeger, and Gilby, where did that come from? Well, sitting around the table, there happened to be a bottle of Gilby's gin. Now, that's how John F. Gilby was born. I know this is true. Not only do we have pictures in the book showing Don Eagle, which happens to be Donn Draeger flexing with the weightlifter's gambit. He went that away. But this is the picture, the photograph of Donn Draeger posing for that drawing. And not only that, in the audience today, we have George Arrington, one of our first students back in Virginia. He was at that first demonstration in 1970, and he actually met the real John Gilby, Robert W. Smith, and he signed the book. What did he say, George?
To George, the only guy that ever whooped me, J. Gilby.
Okay, all right. So enough of the funny stuff, back to the serious stuff. Draeger, during the last decade of his life, was bringing everything together with his knowledge of fighting disciplines, his interest in weapons, all of the research he was doing, and he was bringing it under the banner of Hoplology, which is the study of warriors, weapons, and their fighting systems, study of human combative behavior and performance. This is an old academic discipline that he was able to revitalize, and in his research on the sword, he read the book of the sword by Sir Richard Burton. Burton was a swordsman in the 1800s, mid-1880s. He wrote the book of the sword. He traveled around the world. He had a very intense interest in weapons, but not only that, their systems of use specific to the area and the culture they came from. What Draeger added to the mix was the experience of the warrior, what it's like for the psychology and also for the emotions when you have to encounter a life and death situation. We're going to listen to Donn Draeger talk a little bit about Hoplology. Part of this clip is a tape of a tape. So as he described it, it sounds a little bit like Donald Duck, but you'll get a taste of it anyway.
We're going to dwell on that just for a minute, giving you the standpoint of culture from the side of Hoplology. You're going to hear that word, you've seen it on your little brochure. We're going to talk more about it at the end of the period, tomorrow. Hard to spell. Hoplology. This is the new discipline. It's new because it's just been renovated. It's an old discipline from the 19th century that almost died out. It's concerned, as far as you're concerned, with the study of weaponry and systems of combat. And not only man's, all levels of social complexity, but we are focusing today on man. So, this discipline has a very strict view on culture.
One point to consider, and not to get bogged down in semantic problems, is that Hoplology, of course, does take war into consideration in all the military and naval aspects and the aeronautic aspects of war. But actually, war is one of the smallest segments of hoplological study. This point is not generally well understood even by anthropologists who connote to make the big jump from aggression to war. Lorenz is guilty of this, and many of the other people who have written about aggression make the same mistake. There's a lot more to man's combativeness than war. Even today, there's more going on in the sense of general fighting and combative training than war has ever seen or produced. So let's not make the mistake that we center our study on military and naval sciences, that is, study of war, the people that go with it. So another consideration, I'm going to bring these things out in Hoplology's articles because of the confusion in the past and confusion which will seriously undermine understanding of Hoplology from the outside if it's not clarified. Another one is it's a technical definition, but we're not entirely concerned, however importantly, with martialness, that is, the martial man, the martial systems. In truth, combative systems include martial as well as civil systems of fighting and the weapons that articulate these systems. So
martialness is actually a very small portion of the overall worldwide combative study. There have been very few truly martial societies in the world. We haven't done a complete statistical survey, but at this moment you can count them on your hands. There aren't very many. So a lot of people get the idea that all fighting arts are martial arts. This is, of course, the Etic opinion, which is very, very wrong. We made a big point of this in lectures in Europe, and people finally beginning to see the fine point of it. And that misunderstanding is one of the bases for all of their errors about martial study and civil study, that is civil combative. It's too lengthy to go into here, but maybe my future writings will clue you on to the Hoplology standpoint on martialness and combativeness. In other words, martialness is just a subset of the overall combative scheme, and the majority of man's vicissitudes and man's energies and so on have been dealing with combativeness on a civil level and levels other than martial.
A big part of Hoplology was the field work, and this is what his weapon safaris were all about. And as we saw earlier, as early as 1966, he was going out on these long 3-month trips to study weapons and fighting arts with cultures that were actually still using them. He would generally take 3 or 4 guys that were interested in doing this type of work with him. And the next clip will talk a little bit about field trips.
Now, the subject of field trips, going out into the field. I feel as though I've got about 3 more years of field experience left in me, that is physically. I think in the next 3 years I can still skulk my way around up and down the mountains, through the jungles and so on as is necessary, and I plan to do so. Without this field experience, it is impossible to train well-qualified hoplologists. On each of the trips that I have planned for the coming years, I will take a small body of men with me, with the hopes that they can further inspire themselves and get more deeply locked into the study of hoplology. There's no experience for the field. The theory is fine, but you've got to have the data collected in the field to back up what you've been talking about from the top of your head. So next year, this brings up a 1980 schedule. As far as field trips is concerned, there are 3 possibilities. One is, of course, the return to Malaysia for the annual Koburo training, which is held July or August in that particular part of the world. From there will be an expedition outfitted for Assam and parts of India. The Assam part will be mainly devoted to investigation of the Naga tribes, as many as we can squeeze in the time allotted by a visa, and of course by other circumstances. We'll be making it all the way up to the Tibetan border, and in some way trying to make contact with Tibetan people who know something about their own indigenous weapons and combative arts. The whole trip promises to be very interesting. In India proper, we shall be going mainly to Delhi and Madras. We won't be able to get over to Kerala State and some of the other areas. We'll have to save that for another year. But we'll be making a preliminary survey toward the idea of, in future years, making a complete study of all combatives, both weapons, armor, and systems in the land we call India. Another possibility for next year lies in the fact that I must return to Borneo to complete some work I started there some years ago. That'll be last on the list if and when time and finances permit.
His vision for Hoplology was that he would relocate to the Big Island of Hawaii. They had 10 acres of land already set aside for that purpose. And he would create a training center there, and people could come. He would bring instructors, qualified instructors, so people could learn the authentic arts taught in the way they were supposed to be. Let's listen to him talk about the training center in Hawaii.
I'd like to explain a little bit more now about our center, whether at the center itself or at a adjacent training area, such as perhaps we might build on the Big Island. This is related to and connected with the center as an office or administrative center, but it is separate in the sense that it's in a more remote area where training can be carried out without any distraction. At this center, of course, we will have qualified instructors in each and every discipline that we're able to, let's say, get an audience participation in. For instance, if there is a demand for Icelandic Glima, we will bring an instructor from Iceland who is an expert in Glima to teach at the center training ground. We may have one there in Japanese Kenjutsu, maybe Chinese Shaolin, maybe Malay Silat, or Iranian Kushti, Iran. That's going to be a laugh for a while anyway. The idea being that we'll have the world's best at this center. The center itself, the training ground of the center. We have some 10 acres of land presently available, and on this we will build the hostels and the training facilities, both indoor dojo and outdoor dojo types, for the training to be conducted. This is an ambitious program also, and will attract many young instructors and people who are hoplologists and interested in being quite physical. I think that this is a selling point of the center and a source of income, much like your pre-training camps for Olympics and other forms of athletics. We will offer the world's best available training in different disciplines for people who pay for this privilege. We will provide room and board for a fee, and so on and so on. I think you can see all the ramifications here. This will be a very active part of our center, sort of a community in touch with the public kind of thing, where discipline is taught as it properly should be taught, not along the lines that sometimes you see on television or movies.
In 1979, I received a letter from Malaysia. It was an invitation from a man named Karuna Karan. He was the president of the Malaysian Judo Federation. And this was an invite to participate in the first international Judo training camp. Previously in Malaysia, Draeger would go every year to teach a centralized Kobudo training camp to the Malaysians that he had introduced the Jo and other weapons to. In 1978, Shimizu Sensei died, and so in 1979, the International Judo Federation was created, and this was the first international training camp. Karuna said that Draeger had given him my name as a possible person that would be interested. And so when I read this, I kind of got the picture in my mind. Remember Enter the Dragon, Hans Island, where you see everybody all lined up doing their thing. I imagined I would be at the end of the line, looking up, trying to get a glimpse of Donn Draeger leading the charge. And of course, I thought, that's it, I'm going. Excellent. In the invitation, it describes what you have to do. You have to fly to Butterworth, Malaysia. You have to take the ferry over to the island of Penang. Then you have to take the number 9 bus to such and such hotel. Then you have to find this guy and check in with him. So I wrote to Donn Draeger and I said, yes, I got the invitation, I'm going. And I repeated all the instructions to go. Here's what he wrote back to me. He said, "Dear Mike, I hardly know how to begin. Your dedication, I mean. Mike, I know the sacrifice you are making in coming to Malaysia and can only at this instant say thank you. You'll get more from this trip than you can imagine. I only wish you could stay longer and join our expedition this summer after camp. We're going into Sumatra and various islands in the Indian Ocean, weapons and systems study, of course. I did not want to mention this for fear of further confusing you or making you find some way to do the trip. But it is only said to let you know I consider you one of our family, and someday soon, we hope, you'll join us and get field experience in hoplology." He goes on to say other things. He says, Economy in mind, I would suggest, but do not insist, nor do I wish to muck up your plans, so you decide, that if you want, just fly to Japan. Join me and fly down the cheap way. We can get discount tickets to Bangkok and ride a small plane or train to Penang, the latter a 25-hour train ride. So again, my 22-year-old mind, I'm thinking, okay, I just got an invitation to travel with Donn Draeger to Malaysia. That's amazing. There's got to be, I don't know, 6 or 8 guys that are going to meet him there, and we'll all go together. And that's great. So, all right. Well, it turns out that there was one other person that was supposed to join us. For some reason, he was not able to do it. And so Donn Draeger picked me up at the airport, took me back to his 10-mat, 2-room apartment in Japan, in Narita, set me up there. We spent a few days in Tokyo going around saying goodbye and hello to various people, and took the plane to Thailand. Then we took the 25-hour train ride into Malaysia, and I whipped out my 50 questions for Hoplology, and I interviewed him on the way down. We did the camp. The camp was a 5-day affair where you had to train 3 times a week. This is just a picture of the letter. Had to train 3 times a week. I'm sorry, 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. And there was a lecture during the day and also demonstrations at night. Sometimes with ourselves demonstrating, and sometimes with visiting people. Every day we trained. It was a great experience, and then it was over. But Draeger said at that time, you know, I've got about 10 days free until the rest of the guys come for the trip into Sumatra. If you like, if you're interested, I can take you to see some of the instructors that I'm interviewing currently to write books about the styles that they do. Yes, I'm interested. So he took me to visit Mr. Leong of the Phoenix Eye Fist, Mr. Chai Kim of Shaolin Gung Fu, the combat Tai Chi man Lee Pit Lai, also known as the Butcher, the Malaysian Silat man Master Rahman, and then finally Mr. An Ban Tan of an Indian stick fighting art called Salambam. This is Mr. Leong training the dinky little poke, his single knuckle to attack the vital areas. It's a round piece of rubber. Round piece of rubber there. Mr. An Ban Tan is doing empty hand applications of Salambam. Now, this is the stick that they use, the staff, versus deer antlers that have been fashioned into weapons. This is the Butcher showing me how to use the fingers to attack. He was famous for being able to use the back of his hand to smash a cinder block. I visited the Butcher and all the instructors 10 years later, and this is 10 years later. He enjoyed throwing me around, always having a good time. After the Butcher, we went to see Shaolin. This is the Shaolin Kung Fu, back with the Butcher, training around with him, trying different things. Reaction time training with Draeger, looking on with Chai Kim. This is Malaysian Master Rahman, age 64. Excellent shape. I made the mistake of asking if Pencak Silat had joint locks in their system. This lock keeps the other hand from grabbing a knife that might be held in your belt. Choke and joint lock. One of my least favorites. I'm wondering why my shoulders are hurting now. We finished that trip. Draeger took me to the airport. What do you say after an experience like that, your peak martial arts experience of your life? It was still the peak experience of my life. What do you say? Thank you. He said, no words are necessary. You'll be able to come with us on the big trip next year. I flew home. I had obligations back at home, had to get back there. He went off with the rest of the guys to Sumatra. And as a matter of fact, while they were in Sumatra, they visited some members of the Aceh tribe, and they were all poisoned. They all ended up in the hospital with severe amoebic dysentery. They all eventually recovered, but for Draeger, it was the beginning of a downward spiral for his health. Eventually, by 1982, he was diagnosed with cancer of the liver. This is a picture that I took in Hawaii. It's the last picture I took of him. It's the last time I saw him. He's still looking strong. I always imagine the caption reading, "I'm ready. How about you?" I think he would like us to remember him doing what he loved to do, his passion, which is practice the martial arts. Let's conclude our presentation today by watching him practice Shinomusoryu Jojutsu with his good friend Kaminoda Sensei. This time he's on the sword. Thank you very much, everybody, for letting me share my experiences with Donn Draeger, and thank you. Owari.
For some, it's the quest of an empire. For some, it's been the quest of power and riches. For some, the quest for honor. And yet for others, the quest for freedom. Blades and bladecraft have done just that. So Richard Burton has said, the history of the sword is the history of mankind. And that's the journey we are on. No blade culture has defined the world as much as the Spanish bladecraft. And yet, no art develops in a vacuum. It is shaped by those that it interacts and fights with, and also shapes the cultures whether they are conquered or manage to maintain their freedom. In this particular lab, we're going to look at how Spanish bladecraft influenced arts across the 5 continents. We've traversed 20,000 plus miles, Wharton teachers with over 700 years of combined bladecraft experience together in one place at one time, where over 3 days and 40 hours of non-stop training, you will be able to see and experience firsthand how it shaped Europe, how it shaped the bladecraft of Northern Africa, how it developed the arts, both indigenous and otherwise, in Philippines. Moving over to Latin America, from the jungles of Colombia and Panama, how the arts of machete developed. Coming further up north, looking at the arts of the southwest Mexicali region, where the long bullwhip was developed. Or looking at the development of a very American form of fighting, the Bowie bladecraft. The impact on the Asian martial arts itself, with the Chinese art being completely transformed by fencing and fencing footwork. Lastly but not the least, is looking at the biomechanics of what full contact bladecraft does, how it shapes your movement and what works and what doesn't work. This is the experiment we are embarking. The lucky few who come here will get a view of 500 years of bladecraft that developed across 5 continents, and the relationship between the conquerors and the conquered, between the wannabe conquerors and the freedom fighters, between those who fought as pirates and those who fought to maintain their honor. This is that experiment. This is holy blood, holy blade. For more information,